Edward Woodward was not only a good actor, he had a secondary career as a singer of some renown. With a sort of cod operatic voice. He became very successful, certainly with women of a certain age. Got his own TV special, the Edward Woodward Hour. And within this, he did a great spoof of Callan, where Callan met the characters from the Thames popular sitcom Father Dear Father, Patrick Cargill and his daughters, in something that's truly, truly bizarre. In the film version of Hunter, you've got Eric Porter playing him, and he's an actor that can really suggest a sort of lack of conscience. He's someone that he could be really almost two-dimensional in his single-minded idea that he doesn't care about his charges and about Callan. He just cares about the job. He also has, I think, unlike, well, no, a bit in common with the other hunters, there's a bit of a class thing there as well. He seems to be certainly a different class to Callan.
I got cast in the episode I did first, and it was a kind of one-off for me, because I was still working with the RSC, I think at that time probably in London. And my agent just phoned me up one day and said they're offering this part in this series called Callan, a character called Snell. It's quite a nice, not a big part, but quite a nice part. Would you like to do it? And so I read the script, which they sent me obviously, and I read the script and I said, yes, it'd be lovely. And it happened to fit in with a gap I had from work with the RSC. I had little gaps here and there. And I went and did it. And that was my first acquaintanceship with Callan and the series. Callan, I suppose, to put in a nutshell, is the story, or a continuing story, a series of stories, based on a rather shadowy government department called the Section, which was dealing with undesirable people in the country, often spies, but not always spies. And it had a number of operatives, the main one of which was David Callan, played by Edward Woodward. And he was the most experienced and the best operative that they had. And he was assigned to basically get rid of people, kill them. And he was a marvellous sort of shot, and marvellous at karate, and marvellous with knives and everything like that. And he was the main operative. And that's basically what it was about. It was the stories of what he had to do. He was assisted by various other people, but that's the basic premise. Changing lines is fine when you have a lot of rehearsal. The problem is when you're doing immediate filming, like you arrive, at 7 in the morning to film a scene which you've not rehearsed, and actors are asking to change lines. That is when it gets really tricky, because sometimes those lines are your cue, and if the line is changed, your cue makes no sense. That is very difficult because you have to think on the spot. But when you have plenty of time, as we did with Callan, we had 10 or so days rehearsal, most of those tweaks took place in the early stages of rehearsal. So obviously you could talk about and discuss them, iron them out, and by the time you'd finish the rehearsal period, the new lines, or the tweaked lines, would be second nature, and there'd be no problem.
At the time, every actor wanted to be in Callan, every director wanted to direct Callan, and every writer wanted to write for Callan. And all of those ingredients add up to making a fantastic show, because when all the best people want to be in it, everyone's pushing in the same direction or pulling in the same direction. And it really was a fantastic show. I was very lucky, in fact, that I was free to do Callan, because I did this series called Haunted, about a university lecturer who investigated the paranormal and kinetics and telekinesis and things that go bump in the night. That was produced by Michael Chapman, who then went on to produce the executive producer on the bill. And it was a time when ABC were taken over, or they merged with ATV, and they decided not to do any more of Haunted. And I believe at the same time that Callan had been put on the shelf, because that was an old ABC show. And then when my series finished, I was free. And when they decided, let's do Callan again, I think Tony Valentine wasn't free. And so they wrote a character for me. One of the reasons why I didn't find it necessary to go to a producer or writers and say, wouldn't it be a good idea if James Cross did this? Because the writing was so good that I can remember every time you got a new script of a new episode of Callan, it was like having a present, you know, a Christmas present. You open it up and you couldn't wait to read it. We were all the same. Teddy was the same. And you would read it and you'd think, gosh, I'm doing that this week. This is wonderful. And it really was very good writing. Well, it was actually very interesting because Anthony Valentine, when Mears came back, Anthony Valentine is a terrific actor, very subtle actor. I think I'm a bit more, what's the word, a bit more expressive. I wouldn't say a bit more overacting, but I mean I'm more physical. I'm more dynamic in a way. I don't mean that in an immodest way. I think I've got more. I had more energy, and what was very good is when if you go back to originally when they asked me to do Callan, and I said I didn't want to be a new Toby Mears, and they said no, we're not asking you to do that. We want you to bring a new character. You then have to think, well, actually, how am I going to make this character not different from the Toby Mears character, but you do want it to be different, but you don't play him with a limp. No, you can't do that because Russell Hunter's doing that. You know what I mean? You have to put a false nose on. And so I tried to do it with my own personality in the way that I would play the character rather than another character playing the character. And so when we were in it together, it was very interesting to see that we were very different. And the two characters were different, that even though we might both have been reasonably good-looking chaps and reasonably the same height, roughly the same age, you know, but we were very different characters, which I thought was good. And so it sort of showed me that my character, the way that I was playing my character had worked. Very lovely actor to work with, really good actor. What I loved about Callan was that, and I still don't know to this day what department we were in. Everybody used to say, "Who are you?" And we were some sort of secret police force that was never named. We were never called anything. They never said you're the Secret Bureau of Information or the FBI or the CIA. We didn't know who we were. We knew that we were, which was rather good because it lent you an edge of the unknown. It was a very, very happy time in my life. I loved the show and I'm very proud of it.
Well, the Trevor Preston, Pamela Lonsday, Reggie Collin thing, we all worked together on an arts programme called Tempo. Reggie and Pamela produced and directed it, and I did the research on it. So we were all pals, and I'm a real London lad, and I think it was Reggie just said, "Why don't you come and do a Callan?" Or Lloyd Shirley, somebody like that said. And I desperately wanted to move because I'd done a lot of children's stuff, thoroughly enjoyed it, but I needed to move on as a writer. And so I wrote a Callan, and I was able to put in that sort of London feel, which the other writers who weren't London people, I knew the argot, and so I wrote one. I loved particularly Lonely, and I was able to use quite a lot of London slang in it, which made him more believable. So that's really the way it came about, and that first Callan opened the door for me to go on writing adult. I never went back to write any children's stuff after that. I know it was like the Sweeney, it was one of those programmes that actors wanted to work on, so we got pretty high standard of actors doing quite small parts at times. I once asked a very senior policeman I was talking to about some work, and he'd been in special branch, and I said to him, and he liked Callan, so I said to him, "Tell me something." I said, "Is there a department that there's a sort of, assassins now?" He said, "Well, let's put it this way, Mr. Preston." He says, "There's a lot of people who fly to Heathrow that don't fly out again."
I wanted it to look as if it was a very difficult thing to do, that it wasn't easy. These problems that he had were mostly against Russian agents. Both sides behaved badly, in a sense, and it was just not a very pretty department that sort of had to exist. We weren't doing programs for ratings. We were doing programs because we wanted to do them and felt that they were something, we hoped, worth watching. people used to say to me, who do you actually make programmes for? And I used to say, I make them for my mum, because on the principle, if she enjoys it, a lot of other people will too. Because who do I know who was actually going to watch what strata of society or whatever? So you just did what you felt was right. I had been in hospital, and one day, in those days, visiting hours were sort of 5 till 6, and that was it. One afternoon, the nurse came and said, would it be all right, your brother's come to see you? Well, since I don't have a brother, that was a bit strange. So I said, fine, because it turned out to be a friend who was in the army, and he hadn't got time to come at 6 o'clock, so he simply made up the fact he was my brother. And in this particular script, I used that, knowing that Callan, not having a brother, would know that something suspicious is up.
My father wrote at home 90% of the time. He had an office in his flat in Kensington, and he would sit at his desk and handwrite everything, most of it with the same Parker pen. However, when he went out, he would always take a notepad and a pen. He used to write in the pub sometimes. He would jot down ideas. Something would attract his attention. Somebody would tell him a story or a joke that we'd want to incorporate. So he was always scribbling, always scribbling. He liked to travel. He travelled all over Europe, and when he was away, he would always be writing, because he might go away for 6 or 7 weeks at a time. And that would be far too long for my father to go without putting anything down on paper. So he would naturally always have a notepad and a pen and his pen on the go. It was just the way he was. Like the rest of us might put a handkerchief in our pockets, he would take the pen and paper. The tough, gritty persona of the average northerner, as perceived from the outside, I think is reflected in his characters. And not least David Callan, who, although is a southerner, he's a Londoner, he does possess many of those traits. He is at the same time hard and yet caring. He is passionate. He is an individual. He is determined. And I think those traits are fairly easily associated with people from the north. One of Teddy's great passions was Indian food. And my stepmom, being Anglo-Indian, was a great cook, and regularly they would have dinner together, and Teddy would sit with a plate full of curry in front of him, thoroughly enjoy it, and they would exchange stories, chat about the series, talk about future storylines, talk about character development, and that's something I remember very, very clearly.
I watched it. Very simple. I was already building up a reputation in television, and people had said, why aren't you writing for Callan? And I said, well, because nobody's asked. That's my normal usual. And anyway, very, very quickly, I don't think the first series, I wasn't involved in the first series, but George Markstein came to me and said, come over and have a talk. And with that, I started, and all through him, really. He was A, a friend, and B, in control of the series. So as far as I was concerned, it was perfect. If I was writing a script for Callan, it would take a month. It would take 2 weeks of research and working it all out, and 2 weeks of writing, and that was it. It never turned around to 9 months or 6 weeks. It never did. That was the way I wrote. So the implication of the first half of the energy was to do with knowing about the people you were writing. It was great if you were given characters to create. And there are just a couple of occasions when I remember Teddy saying, don't make him too big. We don't want him taking over what we're doing. But no, generally speaking, it's fine. George and I were sitting in after a guild thing, and he said, "What are you going to do next for us?" And I said, "Well, actually, I haven't got an idea. I haven't got an idea. If somebody came and said, I want 15 scripts about an underwater rabbi, I would have them, but I haven't got one for you." And he said, "Okay, I'll tell you a story." And that was George. He never kept it for himself. He had this new story. He said, "I have a friend who was a combination of journalist and stroke agent, or person not supposed to be an agent but was there. And he was, he had to do things like report on the beat things in Russia. But the whole point about his appointment for this job was that they wanted him to go to a specific hotel and bring back a coat hanger, which he did. And that coat hanger was made of material from the latest aircraft, that the leftover material, and they just used everything up, and in that sense they used it for a... Anyway, he told me this, and he said, this happened quite a while ago, he said, but this has only just been broken, so I can tell it to you. And I said, "It's a terrific story. I'd love to use it." "Use it," he said, "do it." So that, I think, was the best one I did, which was about Russia and about what it was saying and not doing, or doing and not saying. And therefore, whatever pressure was on me was liberated by a good story, backed by George. Nobody else is going to say no. And that was the best one I did, purely because it was real. Now, if you want to lean that against the other scripts and say, was the other stuff real? Did you? Of course some of it was not real. Of course some of it was. But I could tell the story I wanted to tell. So whatever I am believing in gets reflected. I was put in contact with a convict who came out after something like 8 or 9 years, grievous bodily harm. And I wanted to meet somebody, how do they deal with the actual coming out, and how, because I wanted it for the show. And I met him and we had a smashing meal, and he was okay. And then right at the end, he said, I said, "Is there anything else you want?" He said, "I'd like to meet Mr. Callan." I said, "All right, okay, we'll organise that. You can come to, I've got a show being done, you can come to the rehearsal and then seeing it recorded." Okay, lovely, lovely. So the day came and he watched the whole of the afternoon anyway, seemed to me to be regurgitating one scene to get it right. And then that bound up the show, and then we all went off to the bar afterwards, and in came dear Mr. Callan. And so I said to Teddy, I said, "Look, there's a guy over here who wants to meet you, and it's really sort of big." He said, okay. He came across, and I said, "This is so-and-so, and this is Mr. Callan." I did make the mistake of saying, "This is Mr. Callan," but this big tough man who'd almost killed somebody, so put his hand out as if he was at a kind of reception party, and it was limp, and this was the handshake, but it wasn't. It was like somebody to be kissed on the back of the palm, and he said, "This is an honour, Mr. Callan. Mr. Callan, thank you very much." And Teddy sort of could see there was a problem. He said, "Well, thanks very much, and hope you're okay." "Yes, I am, Mr. Callan, thank you." And he went away. We took him home and he ran away into the night, and I've never seen him since. But he made no distinction whatsoever between Callan, the part, and Teddy, the actor. He hadn't seen the actor at all. He'd only seen Callan. And I've often worked on that idea. Never made it work yet, but I've often wondered where he was in his head.
The main difficulty came with Under Starter's Orders, came at the final scene, which was shot on the top of a hotel in Baker Street on the roof. And the night we came to do it, there was quite a hefty wind. And the makeup supervisor sidled up to me to tell me that the villain who they were hunting on this rooftop actually had a hairpiece. a very good hairpiece, because I'd gone through rehearsals with him and never realised that it was a hairpiece, and it had been made in America and at great expense and was wonderful. But she did warn me that it wouldn't stand up to this amount of wind. So I had to then reblock everything that I intended to do on this rooftop so that this character could stay in the lee of chimneys and outbuildings so that his hairpiece would stay intact. As a result, we got very heavily behind, and the final shootout took place at 1 o'clock in the morning, which brought the police down on our heads in no uncertain manner, and we were all dressed down for at least half an hour before we were allowed to go home. Act of Kindness was written by Michael Winder. To my shame, I can't remember Michael very well, but I do know that I had many meetings with him over these long scenes he'd written, which were a war game on a table between Callan and a character which played by Anthony Nichols, whose name now escapes me. Because it was very technical in the way of war games, and I knew absolutely it was a new thing to me. I knew nothing about war games. My camera script was almost illegible. I had made so many notes on what battalion moved in what direction at any one point in the dialogue, and the 4th Hussars moved to the left, and so on and so forth, that it was almost indecipherable. But Michael was very good. He went through the whole thing with me very carefully, and finally I got the whole thing into my head. But of course it nearly drove the crew insane in the studio, because we had to take innumerable close-ups from all sorts of different angles of these toy soldiers being moved across this table. All the moves were designed as subtext to the dialogue that was taking place between Callan and Anthony Nichols. And it was a real headache, but I think we made it in the end.
I went to see Lloyd Shirley, who was running the drama department at ABC Television. And Lloyd Shirley and I got on very well, and eventually I ended up doing really quite a lot for Lloyd over 6 or 8 years. I think the first thing that I did was A Public Eye. But then they were starting this Callan series, and so they gave me a Callan. So how did I hear about it? Well, I was a young director trying to make a name, trying to establish contacts and work with an interesting department, because ABC was a very interesting department. It had done armchair theatres, and it was the best place to be apart from the BBC. And so Lloyd, red-haired Canadian, choleric, irascible, affectionate, imaginative, a nice man, a good TV executive, really good TV, important TV executive, said, well, come and do this, and then we got this show, come and do Callan. As a director, you had great freedom, apart from the constraint of time. The constraint of budget, you couldn't go anywhere, but within the parameters of the job, it was absolutely down to you as director. And you had to make it work. You had to be able to work really fast, think fast, command a studio, get what you wanted out of the actors, get what you wanted out of the crew, out of the cameramen, excite them. Because they were in there all the time, you know, they got bored, or their feet got sore, so on. So you had to arrive at a studio showering them with electricity, so that they were really geared up, that this is going to be absolutely bloody marvellous. Because it was a production line. I mean, the studios, they were all rostered. They did 5 days, 2 days, you know, they did their rosters, and they worked on lots of, you know, children's TV and talk shows and so on. So usually they were very fired up because they were delighted to be doing a Callan or something else like that, the sort of things that I did. People were very thrilled. The crews were usually excited to do it, but one did have to inspire them all the time.
I lived at that time with my family in Marylebone, and I went to a bookshop in Soho, and I was so innocent. I went in to buy a couple of books, and the proprietor suddenly came to me and said, "Would you like something else?" And I didn't understand what he meant. And I said, "Yes." And I thought he meant rare books. And he took me into a back shop, which had pegboarding on the door. And then he opened the door, pushed me in, went in, locked the door, bolted it, looked out through the pegboard into the bookshop, and then showed me a whole tray load of pornographic books. I was completely shocked at everything. Anyway, just to let you know, you see, later in the series, Callan says to Lonely, "I've got a hideout somewhere. Can you think of a place?" And he ends up in the back shop of a pornographic bookshop. And there's Callan saying, "Oh, Lonely," with this gust, These are the things that happen to you in life, and you know. And of course, Lonely was the character to do it. And he would say, "Sorry, Mr. Callan, it's the only place I could think of," It was a scene, I always remember it, where Rad was eating his al fresco lunch at his desk, and he had hummus. And Callan tried it and said, "Ooh, dear, what's that?" "Oh my God, what are you eating?" And Ronnie Rad would say, as Hunter would say, "It's hummus, Callan, try some more," and just sort of things like that. But it was a good badinage.